The Nazi concentration camps were places of extreme cruelty, where people were stripped of their humanity and treated as disposable. For years, this vast system remained hidden until the final days of World War II, when the world was forced to confront the truth behind one of the most disturbing camp systems in human history. It all started in 1933 when Adolf Hitler became the leader of Germany. Almost immediately, the country began to change. Hitler and the Nazi Party believed that anyone who disagreed with them was dangerous. They did not want debate, criticism, or opposition of any kind. So their first move was to remove these people from society. Within weeks of taking power, Nazis began arresting anyone they saw as an enemy of the state. By March 1933, just 2 months after Hitler took office, the Nazis opened Dachau. This was the very first concentration camp. At the time, Dachau was not meant for mass murder. It was meant to scare people into silence. The first prisoners were political opponents, including communists, socialists, journalists, and trade union leaders. These were people who had spoken out against Hitler or warned others about the Nazis. Inside Dachau, the rules were harsh from the very start. The guards were trained to show no mercy. Prisoners were beaten for small mistakes, shouted at constantly, and forced into exhausting labor. Cruelty was encouraged. In October 1933, Theodor Eicke, the commandant of Dachau, wrote a strict set of camp rules. These rules allowed guards to punish prisoners however they wanted. Even tiny offenses could lead to death. Stealing food, talking back, or failing to work fast enough could mean being shot. Eicke's system was so brutal that the Nazis decided to copy it. Dachau became the model for every concentration camp that came after it. Over the next few years, the Nazis expanded this system across Germany. As Hitler grew more confident, the camps multiplied. By 1939, there were 6 more major concentration camps. Sachsenhausen opened in 1936. Buchenwald followed in 1937. In 1938, 3 more camps appeared, including Neuengamme, Flossenberg, and Mauthausen. Ravensbrück, a camp mainly for women, opened in 1939. Each camp followed the same basic design. Prisoners were locked inside wooden barracks surrounded by barbed wire. Guard towers stood over them at all times. Escape was nearly impossible. Violence was constant. At first, the camps were filled mostly with political prisoners, but that soon changed. The Nazis began arresting anyone they considered undesirable. This included homeless people, disabled individuals, Roma, Jehovah's Witnesses, and others who did not fit the Nazi idea of a pure society. Jewish people in particular began to feel the pressure growing stronger every year. In 1935, the Nazis passed the Nuremberg Laws. These laws stripped Jewish people of German citizenship. Jews were no longer seen as equals under the law. They lost basic rights. They could not vote. They could not marry non-Jews. They were pushed out of jobs, schools, and public life. This was legal discrimination, written into law, and it made future violence easier. That violence exploded in November 1938. On the night of November 9th and into November 10th, Nazi mobs attacked Jewish communities across Germany and Austria. This event became known as Kristallnacht, or the Night of Broken Glass. Synagogues were burned to the ground. Jewish-owned shops were smashed and looted. Streets were covered in shattered glass. Police didn't stop the violence. Instead, they joined in. That same night, the Nazis arrested about 26,000 Jewish men. They were dragged from their homes and sent straight to concentration camps. Dachau alone received nearly 11,000 Jewish prisoners after Kristallnacht. Inside the camp, these men were beaten, screamed at, and packed into overcrowded barracks with political prisoners. Many were held for weeks or months. Some were released, but only under strict conditions. Most were forced to promise they would leave Germany forever. Less than a year later, in September 1939, World War II began. Nazi Germany invaded Poland, and the war quickly spread across Europe. As German armies advanced, they captured millions of people. Soldiers, civilians, and entire communities fell under Nazi control. With this expansion came an even larger camp system. The Nazis began building concentration camps outside Germany in occupied territories. In 1940, the SS built Auschwitz in occupied Poland. At first, Auschwitz was used to hold Polish political prisoners, but it didn't stay small for long. It quickly expanded into a massive camp complex. It would later become the most infamous camp in history. Other camps appeared as well. Majdanek was established in 1941. Dozens of forced labor camps and prison camps spread across occupied Europe. The system grew wider and more organized with every passing month. At the same time, Jewish people across Europe were being rounded up and forced into ghettos. These were crowded neighborhoods sealed off from the rest of the city. Families lived in terrible conditions with little food or medical care. From these ghettos, Jews were put onto trains. They were told they were being resettled. They were promised work, homes, or a new life elsewhere. But this was a lie. Most of those trains were not going to new towns or jobs. They were heading toward camps. And for many, they were heading straight toward death. By 1941, the Nazis had decided to go further as imprisoning and abusing Jewish people was no longer enough. The war had spread across Europe, and millions of Jews now lived under Nazi control. Inside the Nazi government, discussions shifted from persecution to complete destruction. This decision did not happen in public. It was planned quietly behind closed doors. In January 1942, senior Nazi officials met at a villa near Berlin for what became known as the Wannsee Conference. At this meeting, they agreed on a plan they called the Final Solution. This was a clear and deliberate decision to kill all Jewish people in Europe. The Nazis estimated that around 11 million Jews lived across the continent, and they planned to eliminate every single one of them. To carry out this plan, the Nazis needed places built specifically for killing. They chose occupied Poland, far from Germany, where secrecy was easier, and Jewish populations were large. Between 1941 and 1945, the Germans built 5 special death camps, also known as killing centers. These camps were Chelmno, Belzec, Sobibor, Treblinka, and Auschwitz-Birkenau. Unlike earlier concentration camps, these were not meant to hold prisoners for long periods. Their main purpose was fast, large-scale murder. These death camps worked like factories designed for killing. Trains arrived daily, sometimes hourly. People were murdered almost immediately after stepping off the transport. There were no trials, no records of names, and no chance to survive for most victims. Across these 5 killing centers, around 2.7 million Jews were exterminated in just a few years. The scale of death at each camp was massive. At Belzec, about 434,500 Jews were murdered. Almost no one survived because the camp existed only to kill. Treblinka was even deadlier, with roughly 925,000 people murdered. Sobibor saw around 200,000 deaths before prisoners staged a revolt. Chelmno was different, but just as deadly. There, the Nazis used gas vans, trucks where victims were locked inside and poisoned while being driven away. At least 152,000 Jews were killed at Chelmno, along with thousands of Roma. Auschwitz-Birkenau became the largest and most notorious of all the death camps. It was both a labor camp and an extermination center. More than 1.1 million people were killed there, and about 1 million of them were Jews. The camp kept growing as the Nazis perfected their killing process. New gas chambers and crematoria were built to handle the constant arrivals. Victims arrived at these camps by the thousands. Most had already suffered for days in overcrowded cattle cars with no food, water, or toilets. When they arrived, SS guards shouted orders and told them to line up. They were told they were only stopping briefly to shower or rest after the long journey. This lie was carefully planned to keep people calm and prevent panic. Men, women, and children were ordered to undress and leave their belongings behind. They were led into large concrete rooms that looked like showers. In reality, these rooms were gas chambers disguised with fake shower heads to deceive the victims. Once the doors were sealed, guards released poison gas inside. Zyklon B was used at Auschwitz, while carbon monoxide was used at other camps. Within minutes, everyone inside was dead. In 1944, this process reached its peak at Auschwitz during the deportation of Hungarian Jews. That year, the Nazis sent about 430,000 Hungarian Jews to Auschwitz. Around 320,000 of them were sent directly to the gas chambers upon arrival. Only about 110,000 were selected for forced labor and temporarily kept alive. The killing was systematic and ruthless. No one was spared. Babies, young children, the elderly, and the sick were murdered immediately because the Nazis considered them useless for work. One of the victims of this system was Anne Frank, the Jewish girl whose diary later became world famous. She didn't die in a gas chamber. Instead, she died of typhus at Bergen-Belsen in early 1945, at just 15 years old, after enduring months of imprisonment. Death in the camps wasn't limited to gas chambers. Nazi doctors carried out cruel medical experiments on prisoners. In Dachau and other camps, SS doctors froze inmates to study hypothermia. Others were deliberately infected with malaria or other diseases to test drugs. Prisoners were treated like lab animals. Hundreds died as a result of these experiments, and many others were left permanently damaged. Life inside the concentration camps was built to break people down from the very first moment they arrived. Every day before sunrise began with a roll call. Prisoners were dragged out of their barracks and forced to stand outside in long rows. They had to remain completely still while guards counted them again and again. This process often took hours. It didn't matter if it was freezing cold, raining heavily, or snowing. Prisoners were not allowed to move. Anyone who collapsed from weakness or sickness was beaten, trampled, or shot in front of others. Guards did not rush roll call. If the numbers didn't match their lists, they started over, no matter how long it took. Once roll call finally ended, most prisoners were sent to work. The work was brutal and endless. Prisoners labored for hours without breaks, often on very little food. Many jobs were designed to be pointless or impossible. The goal wasn't productivity, but exhaustion and death. One of the worst examples was at Mauthausen. There, starving prisoners were forced to carry massive stone blocks up 186 steep steps every day. They had to move quickly, even though they were weak and barely alive. Many fell under the weight. Guards often shot them where they collapsed. This system had a name. The Nazis called it extermination through work, meaning prisoners were worked until they died. When the workday ended, there was no relief. Nighttime offered no safety or comfort. Prisoners were packed tightly into wooden barracks that were filthy and overcrowded. 3 or 4 people were often forced to share a single narrow bunk. Many others had no space at all and slept on the floor. In winter, there was no heating. Cold air came through the broken walls and leaking roofs. Rain and snow soaked the inside of the barracks. Blankets were rare, and many prisoners had none. Food was barely enough to stay alive. Daily rations usually consisted of a thin, watery soup and a small piece of bread. This wasn't enough to replace the energy lost from hard labor. Hunger never went away. It followed prisoners every hour of the day. Over time, their bodies weakened. Faces became hollow. Bones pushed through their skin. Many prisoners became so thin, they looked like walking skeletons. Disease spread quickly in these conditions. The camps were filthy. Lice were everywhere. Dysentery and typhus moved from prisoner to prisoner without control. Medical care barely existed. Camp hospitals were not places of healing. They were places where people went to die. Guards believed prisoners did not deserve treatment or kindness. As one survivor later said, the guards truly believed inmates deserved no better. Anyone who became too sick or too weak to work had almost no chance of survival. Prisoners who could not stand up or keep up were often shot to save food and effort. As the war began turning against Germany and Allied armies moved closer, conditions grew even worse. The Nazis tried to hide their crimes by forcing prisoners out of the camps. These forced evacuations became known as death marches. Prisoners were marched for long distances with little or no food, water, or proper clothing. Guards shot anyone who fell behind. One of the largest death marches happened in April 1945 as American forces approached Dachau. About 25,000 prisoners were forced to march away from the camp. Many of them died from exhaustion, starvation, or were shot along the road. Yet, even under this horror, some people resisted. This resistance didn't look like traditional battle. Prisoners had no weapons, no food, and no real chance of winning. Still, a small number of people decided that dying while fighting back was better than being murdered without a struggle. One of the most important uprisings happened at Sobibor in October 1943. Sobibor was a death camp where almost everyone sent there was killed. Prisoners knew they were going to die sooner or later. A group of Jewish inmates secretly planned a revolt. They knew they couldn't defeat the camp, but they hoped to create chaos and escape. During the uprising, the prisoners managed to kill 11 SS guards and the deputy commandant. This was an incredible moment because SS officers were usually untouchable inside the camps. After the attack, prisoners rushed the fences. About 300 men and women broke out of Sobibor and ran into the surrounding forests. Most of them were hunted down in the following days by German troops and local collaborators. But not all were caught. Around 60 of those who escaped survived the war. Because of this uprising, the Nazis shut down Sobibor soon after and tried to erase it from existence. That same year, prisoners at Treblinka also fought back. In the summer of 1943, inmates there staged another revolt. They set fire to parts of the camp, including gas chambers, and attacked guards with stolen weapons and tools. Like Sobibor, Treblinka was also a death camp where nearly everyone was murdered shortly after arrival. The uprising did not save most of the prisoners, but it proved that the people trapped there were not passive victims. Resistance didn't always look like open rebellion. Most prisoners couldn't escape or fight guards directly. Instead, resistance often took quiet and risky forms. Prisoners hid small amounts of food to share with others. They passed information in whispers. Some sabotaged work by moving slowly or damaging tools. In camp kitchens, a prisoner might secretly salt soup meant for guards, a small act meant to reclaim dignity in a place designed to strip it away. These acts may seem small, but inside the camps they were dangerous. Any prisoner caught helping others or breaking rules could be beaten or killed. Still, people did it anyway. Finally, in 1944 and early 1945, the Allied armies reached the camps. In July 1944, Soviet soldiers became the first to liberate a major concentration camp. That camp was Majdanek, located near the Polish city of Lublin. When the Red Army entered the camp, they were not greeted by celebrations. Instead, they found rows of open mass graves. The ground itself told the story. Inside the camp were survivors who were too sick and weak to stand or speak. Many had been left behind because they were no longer strong enough to march away. Majdanek was one of the first clear pieces of proof that the Nazis had been running camps designed for mass death. 6 months later, in January 1945, Soviet troops reached Auschwitz. By the time the Red Army broke through the gates, the Nazis had already evacuated most of the prisoners. Those who could still walk had been forced onto death marches. Those who remained were the weakest of the weak. Soviet soldiers found about 7,000 prisoners alive. Most were severely emaciated, suffering from disease and barely conscious. The Soviets continued moving forward and soon liberated more camps. Stutthof, Sachsenhausen, and Ravensbrück all fell into their hands. Each camp revealed more horror. Soldiers saw gas chambers, crematoria, piles of bodies, and prisoners who had been starved and beaten for years. The pattern was the same everywhere. The camps had been emptied in a rush, but the evidence of mass murder was impossible to erase. At the same time, Allied forces were advancing from the west. American and British troops began uncovering camps in Germany itself. In April 1945, British soldiers liberated Bergen-Belsen. What they found was overwhelming. Thousands of bodies lay unburied across the campgrounds. Disease was everywhere. Survivors were so weak that many couldn't lift their heads. 1 week later, on April 29, 1945, American soldiers arrived at Dachau, where they found more than 30,000 prisoners still alive, but barely so. Many were close to death from hunger and disease. Nearby, soldiers made another shocking discovery. Freight cars sat on the railway tracks, filled with decomposing corpses. The Nazis had loaded dead bodies onto trains in a last-minute attempt to move or hide them as Allied forces closed in. The scale of what was uncovered left soldiers stunned. Many said nothing in their training had prepared them for what they saw. Some became physically sick. Others stood in silence, unable to understand how this could have happened. World leaders quickly realized that this horror had to be recorded. General Dwight D. Eisenhower ordered soldiers to document everything. He insisted that journalists, photographers, and even local German civilians be brought to the camps to see the evidence with their own eyes. Eisenhower believed that one day people might deny these crimes. He wanted proof that could never be erased. When Allied forces finally won the war in Europe, the camps were empty of their commanders and guards, but they were filled with evidence of mass murder. Survivors were freed, but freedom didn't erase what they'd lost. Families were gone, homes no longer existed, entire communities had been wiped out. The gates of the camps were open at last, but the damage done inside them would never truly end.